So today we're going to talk about populations and samples. This is going to feel a little bit more like a normal math lesson today, but there's still going to be a lot of like social studies kind of aspects to this as well. Let's get started. So today's plan is we're going to look at populations versus samples. We'll talk about different types of samples because there's different ways you can take a sample out of a population. And then of course we'll get some practice in on this one. So hopefully a pretty quick lesson today. Here we go. So first of all, we need to talk about the difference between a population and a sample. There is a difference between a full population and just a sample. We need to understand what that difference is. Let's suppose you wanted to find everyone's favorite flavor of ice cream. If you surveyed everyone in Dutchess, is that a population or is it a sample? What do you think is the difference? Think on that one for a second here. Let's go over it. So, believe it or not, that would actually be depending on your perspective here, but it would likely be a population. A population is just all of the individuals in a group being studied. Now, if you go back to the question, if you were thinking about everyone in the world's favorite flavor of ice cream, well, then in that case, you'd have to say it's just a sample because this is just one town out of an entire world of people. Anyway, so a population, all the individuals in a group being studied. So for example, it could be everyone in Canada might be a population. Could be all adults in Dutchess. It could be all left-handed people. It could be all students at Dutchess School. It could be anything like that, right? So as long as it matches the entire group you're studying, that's what we would call a population. A sample, however, is just any groups of individuals selected from the population. So it's like a subgroup of the group of people you're studying. So for example, you could say it's 100 people just chosen randomly in Canada. It could be every third customer to enter a store, that kind of idea. So it's not the full population you're studying, it's just a small segment of it. Hopefully that'll become a little bit more clear as this lesson goes on. That was kind of just a quick way of going through it. We'll see with several examples what exactly the difference is in a little more detail. Now it is always important, however, to identify what the population is in a given question. No matter what question you're given, whether it's a survey or whatever, you should identify what your population that you're interested in surveying actually is. So sometimes a survey will ask a full population. It'll ask like literally everyone who is part of the population of a group of people who are being studied. For instance, I can just say on a personal note, not that long ago, it was only about a week or two before I'm recording this, I received in the mail a thing from Statistics Canada called the Census, and it's done every couple of years, and they basically ask every single person in Canada to fill it out, or at least every adult in Canada to fill it out. And so I did. So that would have been a survey that was actually looking at a full population rather than just a sample. Now, other times, and it's actually more often, a survey will just ask a sample of the population. They won't ask literally every single person they're wondering about in the whole population. They're just going to ask a small selection. But here's the real kicker. How are samples chosen? Do we do it randomly? And if so, if we're just doing things randomly, how is that done? That's what we're going to focus in on. So there's about, you could argue, 5 different types of samples that we have here, and you will have to understand the difference between all 5. The first one is something called the convenience sample. A convenience sample is just a sample of the population chosen because of how easy it is to access those people. So for instance, maybe you had some sort of a store and you just said, you know what, I'm going to ask the first 10 people to come into the store. That would be the convenience sample. You're not actually getting an accurate representation of everyone who comes into your store, your whole population. You're just getting a convenience sample, so just something that was easy. Now, as much as that sounds like it's a bad thing, a convenience sample can actually be useful. It can be totally valid sometimes. We might see a couple examples where it is, but we'll get there in a bit. Next one, voluntary response. Voluntary response is a pretty common way of doing things. It's a sample created by inviting the whole population to participate on their own. So usually that would look like just saying, hey, if you fill out this survey, we'll thank you, or we'll give you a treat or something like that, right? That's a voluntary response, right? You'll often see that at restaurants where they'll say, hey, fill the survey and you'll get a free, I don't know, ice cream the next time you come into the restaurant or whatever. That's again a voluntary response. Nobody has to do the survey, but you can if you want. Now the next ones, and these ones are more common. It's the random samples, but don't go thinking that random sample is just one way of doing things. There's actually different ways of finding a random sample, and we'll have to understand each one. Now, when we say random, that just means everyone in the population has the same chance of being chosen. There's 3 different kinds of random sample. 3 different kinds of random sample that we do need to understand. The most common one, or at least the one we think of the most, is something called a true random sample. A true random sample is where people are selected completely randomly from the population. This could be you just drew names from a box, or you had a computer program randomly select names. That's a true random sample. And oftentimes that one is a really useful way of collecting information from people. The next one is called a stratified sample. This is created by dividing the whole population into distinct groups and then choosing the same fraction of people from each group. That sounded kind of complex, but let me make this a little bit easier. A good example of a stratified sample, and again, this is a type of random sample, just make sure that's clear. A good example of a stratified sample would be to say you wanted to survey your whole school, so that would be your whole population, but you just broke it down into grade levels, so those are distinct groups, and then chose just a random percentage of people from each group. So maybe say, okay, I'll ask, 30% of each grade. So that'd be the same fraction of people from each group. So if you asked 30% of grade 12s and 30% of grade 11s and 30% of grade 10s and so on, that would be what we call a stratified sample. The last type of random sample is something called a systematic sample. This is created by choosing people at fixed intervals from a list of the population. So that would be a case of saying, you know what, we're going to get a whole list of everyone in the whole population. So maybe if you made a list of everyone in the school and you said, I'll pick every second person. So it's still a random sample because there was just a random rule that you applied. It's just there's some order and system to it, right? So those 5 different things, you do need to know them. Remember, convenient sample is just a sample chosen because it was easy. Voluntary response, that one I think is the most obvious one. That's just, people choose to respond to the survey if they want. True random, also not a very hard one to understand. That's just a random draw names out of a box kind of survey. And then the 2 more tricky ones to understand are stratified sample, where you have them put into groups and then you choose the same fraction from each group, and a systematic sample where you are choosing people at a fixed interval. There's a system to it. Anyway, let's move on. So populations versus samples. I want us in the next couple questions here to identify the population and state whether you would survey the population or just a sample. And if you choose just a sample, what kind of sample from those 5 that we did before? So again, we're identifying a population, we're stating whether it's a population or just a sample, and if it's a sample, we have a third thing to do. What kind of sample would we do? You could also say what would be wrong with the other sampling methods. We'll make that a conversation rather than making it an actual write it down thing. So here's the first situation. A bicycle store owner wants to know which brand of mountain bike her customers prefer. You might want to pause the video here, see if you can identify the population and whether you'd survey the population or just a sample, and if it's a sample, what kind. Okay, let's identify the population here first. So the population in this case, it's a little bit specific, and this is weird for a first one. Since it's a bicycle store that we're dealing with here, the population are customers to that store. Customers to the store. That is our population here. The population isn't literally everyone in the whole country. Not everybody's going to go buy a bicycle, for instance, right? The population are just customers to the store. Now, if we want to know which brand of mountain bike customers prefer, the question would be, should we survey the population or just a sample? And this is where you can turn it into a bit of a debate. But in this case, I think there's a much stronger case to be made for just surveying a sample. The reason you wouldn't want to survey the whole population is maybe some people only go to the store once every year or so. It would be hard to find exactly who's coming to the store. So you just want to get a sample of what type of mountain bike her customers prefer. Now, since we chose a sample, it says what kind of sample would we do here? That's where we really can bring it down to one of many different kinds. Really, since our population is hard to really define here, I wouldn't say we would want to do a systematic sample. I'll go back to show you the definitions. I don't think we'd want to do a systematic sample because it's hard to get a list of everyone who goes to the store. So I think that one's out of there. Same with true random sample and stratified sample. They kind of require us to have a really good grasp of what our population is. So those might be kind of tricky to do. Now, in terms of voluntary response, that one could certainly work because in a voluntary response, you're just asking your customers, hey, can you tell me what bike you prefer? There probably isn't much of an issue with that. And I think a convenient sample would probably be okay in this case too, if you just asked like the first 100 people to come into your store or something. So again, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer here, at least in terms of what type of sample to do here. I definitely wouldn't say you'd want to survey the whole population because that would be really, really tough. But in terms of the type of sample you could do, you could say a convenient sample. You could say, I guess, a voluntary response. I just had to double check that one. Voluntary Voluntary, there you go. Voluntary response could be another one. But if you really wanted to spin this, I said systematic sample wouldn't work. But if you made it a sample so that you were choosing like every fifth person to come into the store, but again, that would kind of tie into a convenience sample. So you know what, I'm not going to worry about that. I'd say convenience and voluntary, probably the most ideal ones here. But you could debate it, right? As long as you gave a reason and what would be wrong with the other sampling methods, we can be flexible on this. There's not really a right or wrong in a lot of this. That's another reason why I was saying it's kind of more like a social studies unit than it is a math one. Anyway, here's a second question, same idea. A school board wants to know how many hours each student spends doing homework or studying each day. So we want to identify our population, say whether we would survey a sample or the whole population. And if it's just a sample, what kind of sample do we want to survey? Pause the video here, see if you can do this one. Okay, so I'm going to identify the population first. The population of this one might be more clear than it was with the bicycle store one. The population in this case are students in that district, right? So the students that are in the district that the school board represents, that would be our population in this case. Now, would we want to survey the population or just a sample? You could certainly try surveying the whole population here. Like a school board would have a list of everyone who's a student in the school board. So if you said population, that would work just fine. But you could also say a sample, because let's be realistic here. Maybe you don't want to ask like literally every person in the whole district this kind of a question. So if we get into the type of sampling methods, if we look at those 5 different ones here, I don't think a convenient sample makes any sense in this case because it's not really a case of how is it easy to access these people. So I wouldn't say that one. A voluntary response could be allowed, but you might end up finding that the people who are doing a voluntary response are more likely to be the ones doing a lot more homework each night. So I don't know if I would go with that one. There might be some bias in the result there. That leads us into our random samples here. You could do a true random sample where you select completely randomly. But the one I'm really leaning towards in this case is a stratified sample. What I think you would probably want to do in this survey is do a stratified sample where you ask a certain number of people from each grade. So you could say how many hours doing homework or studying do the grade 12s do versus the grade 11s versus the grade 10s and so on, right? I think a stratified sample would be without a doubt the best one here, but you could make a certainly good case for a true random, and you probably could make a pretty good case for a systematic sample as well. So again, these are flexible. You could argue one way or another. That's why it's another weird reason with this unit that's kind of like a social studies thing. And it's also weird for me to make videos for this because it doesn't really feel like I'm doing any math, but it is what it is. Anyway, moving on. Now, choosing samples. How could a sample be chosen in the following situations? So in other words, are we what one of those 5 sample methods are we going to do in these situations? So first question, a teacher wants to get feedback regarding a school dance. She plans to ask 5 students out of the 30 in her class. How could you go about doing something like this? Okay, so really there's not a lot of context on this one. In this case, I think a voluntary response would probably work because let's be honest, I don't think everyone in the class really is going to care to go to a school dance. There might be people who just say, oh, you know what, I'm not going anyway, so why are you asking me? Voluntary response would basically open it up so that the people who actually want to go to the school dance are going to be the ones who are volunteering to answer the survey. But notwithstanding that, you could also do a true random, right? Again, an issue with a true random sample in this case might be you might pick some people who don't want to go to that dance. If you did any of the other types, I don't know how a stratified sample would work here, but if you did a systematic sample where you asked every 5th person, or I guess every 6th person, if it's a class of 30, every 6th person in the list, that would work as well. Convenient sample, I would say wouldn't work because that would indicate you're probably just asking the first 5 kids you see. Not exactly the best way of doing it. So no matter how I settle on this one, I think voluntary response, probably the best one to do here. I think this is one of our last ones here. Yeah, it totally is. This is our last question here now. A company wants to know how many envelopes, how many employees, geez Louise, I must be getting tired. How many employees would use a fitness center at the company if it were built? So it's like this company is going to be building a gym on their site. They plan to ask 300 out of their 3,000 employees. So that's their sample out of 3,000 employees. What type of sampling method do you think they should use on this one? Okay, so kind of like the last one, I don't think a convenient sample would make much sense here. That would be asking like the first 300 people you see or something. I don't know if that would be ideal. Now, another one that would be a little weird is if you did a voluntary sample. I think you're going to be more likely to get 300 responses of people who are going to say, yeah, totally, I would totally use the fitness center, because the people who aren't going to use the fitness center probably aren't going to fill out that survey. So you'll end up getting a biased result. Now, this question doesn't say that they're going to build it if 300 of their 3,000 employees say they want it. It just says they're trying to get to know how many employees would actually use this. So if it was just 300 of 3,000 employees, that'd be only like 10% of their employees actually using the fitness center they built. But if they actually ask 300 people and see that the percentage is something different, then that would give them a little bit of a different approach. Long story short, what I'm trying to say here is I think the best way you'd want to do a sample like this is a true random sample. Randomly pick 300 out of your 3,000 employees and say, like, hey, would you use a fitness center? That'll give you a more even response on this one. If you really wanted to go crazy on this, you could say a stratified sample. I don't know how you would stratify this. You maybe could stratify it by the age of the employees. I think if that were the case, you'd probably find certain age groups are more likely to use the fitness center than others, but maybe not. Maybe you wouldn't. A systematic sample could also work. Systematic sample where you ask if it's 300 out of 3,000 employees, you'd ask like every 10th person on your list. That would work as well. Either way, basically any of the random samples, probably the way to go on this one. If you said something different and you wanted to argue about it though, go for it. There's a lot of ways you could argue and back this up. It's all a matter of opinion on this stuff, for the most part, at least. There are certain questions where it certainly doesn't make sense. Like especially that last one, I don't know, I don't know if a convenient sample really works too well with it, but again, you can argue pretty much anything on these. Whew. Anyway, so for practice, these first set of questions, page 419, that's from yesterday. I would say page 427 is what you want to focus on today. We will work on those questions again tomorrow. Tomorrow's lesson will probably be a little bit shorter than this one, but it's covering the same material. Anyway, if you need any help, please reach out. Best of luck.